When we picture the Second World War, we picture combat. We see beaches raked by machine gun fire, cities burning under bomber formations, tanks grinding through hedgerows in Normandy. We see men charging, shooting, dying. Decades of cinema and photography have trained our minds to compress the most destructive conflict in human history into a highlight reel of violence. But that reel is a distortion. For the vast majority of the roughly 70 million men and women who wore a uniform between 1939 and 1945, the war was not defined by the moments they pulled a trigger. It was defined by everything else. The average Allied combat infantryman in the European theater spent approximately 10 days out of every month in actual contact with the enemy. 10 days. The rest was something far less cinematic, far less quotable, and far more representative of what war actually felt like from the inside. To understand what the Second World War really was for the people who fought it, we have to set aside the charges and the landings and look at the other 20 days. And when we do, the picture that emerges is not one of relentless heroism. It is one of exhaustion, monotony, mud, and the strange psychological endurance required to wait, for weeks, sometimes months, for something terrible to happen. Before a soldier ever saw a battlefield, the war had already begun reshaping him. The process started the moment he stepped off a bus at a training camp and was stripped of nearly everything that made him a civilian. In the United States alone, over 16 million people were inducted during the war, a number so large that processing them required more than 60 major training installations spread across every region of the country, transforming that many ordinary men, farmers, clerks, students, all factory workers, into functioning soldiers was one of the largest institutional efforts in human history. Basic training lasted between 13 and 17 weeks, depending on the branch, and its purpose was not merely to teach a man how to fire a rifle. It was to dismantle his civilian identity and replace it with reflexes that would keep him alive and obedient under conditions no classroom could simulate. The days began before dawn. Recruits marched, ran, and crawled under barbed wire with live rounds fired over their heads, dug foxholes, filled them in, and dug them again. They learned to field strip an M1 Garand blindfolded until the sequence of disassembly became automatic. Trigger group, follower rod, bolt, operating rod. Their hands finding each component in the dark the way a musician finds notes without looking at the keys. They were shouted at, punished collectively for individual failures, and denied sleep to build tolerance for the chaos of combat. The British system was similar in philosophy, if different in style, less theatrical, more quietly grinding, rooted in regimental tradition that stretched back centuries. Soviet training was often brutally compressed, sometimes lasting only weeks before men were sent directly to the front with minimal instruction and, in the war's early desperate years, sometimes without a personal weapon. The German Wehrmacht maintained one of the most thorough training systems in the world, with a particular emphasis on Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics that gave individual squads a level of tactical flexibility their opponents often struggled to match. But regardless of nation, the outcome was the same. A man arrived as a civilian, he left as something else. His body had been conditioned for sustained physical labor, and his mind had been conditioned for obedience. What no training program anywhere in the world could adequately prepare him for was the dominant actual experience of the war, not combat. Waiting. The phrase that defined military life across every theater and every army was 4 words long. Hurry up and wait. A unit would be roused at 3 in the morning, told to pack everything, march 6 miles to a staging area, and then sit there for 14 hours while nothing happened. Orders changed, convoys stalled, weather-grounded air support. Bridges were destroyed, supply lines had not caught up. The machinery of modern industrialized war involved coordinating millions of people, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and staggering quantities of material across entire continents. And the friction of that coordination produced one constant, reliable output: delay. The U.S. Army alone operated a supply chain that stretched from factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh across the Atlantic to depots in England, and then across the Channel to Normandy, and eventually deep into the heart of Germany, a logistical pipeline of over 3,000 miles. Every breakdown in that chain, every bottleneck at a French port, Every bombed rail junction in the Rhineland translated directly into soldiers sitting in a muddy field with nothing to do and no information about when they would move again. The boredom was not passive, it was corrosive. Men sat in foxholes, in staging areas, in the holds of transport ships, in rain-soaked tents pitched in mud so deep it swallowed boots whole, and they waited with the knowledge that the waiting could end at any moment in violence. This was not the boredom of a slow afternoon at home. It was boredom saturated with dread, the particular psychological torment of having nothing to do while knowing that something terrible was coming, but not when. A comprehensive survey conducted by the U.S. Army's research branch found that the single most common complaint among frontline combat soldiers was not fear, not physical danger, not even the quality of the food. It was inactivity. The mind, left idle in a threatening environment, turned on itself. Soldiers played cards, endless, grinding, joyless rounds of poker and blackjack and rummy, not because they particularly enjoyed it, but because it occupied the part of the brain that would otherwise spend every waking minute calculating the statistical likelihood of dying. They wrote letters home, sometimes 2 or 3 a day, when there was nothing else to fill the hours. They cleaned their weapons 3 or 4 times in a single sitting, not because the weapon was dirty, but because the ritual of disassembly and reassembly was calming in its mechanical predictability. They told the same jokes they had already told 100 times, repeated the same stories about home and girls and what they would eat first when the war ended, and developed elaborate private superstitions about lucky charms, unlucky numbers, and which side of a foxhole a man should sleep on. One American infantryman stationed in Italy recorded in his diary that he had played over 2,000 hands of rummy during a single month of rear line inactivity. He won $11 total. He noted this fact with the flat precision of a man for whom those 2,000 hands were not recreation, but a method of psychological survival, and through all of it, they ate, or more precisely, they endured what the military classified as food. The U.S. Army's logistical achievement in feeding its forces was genuinely staggering in scale. At its peak, the American military was producing and shipping over 5 million tons of food per year to overseas theaters, a volume that required its own dedicated fleet of refrigerator ships and a distribution network larger than most civilian grocery chains. But scale and quality occupied entirely different worlds. The K ration, introduced in 1942 as a short-term individual combat meal designed by University of Minnesota physiologist Ansel Keys, and quickly became the default daily sustenance for millions of soldiers over months of continuous use, far beyond its original intended duration of no more than 15 consecutive meals. Each daily unit contained roughly 2,800 calories divided into breakfast, dinner, and supper components. Compressed biscuits, a small tin of processed meat or cheese, a few pieces of hard candy, a packet of instant coffee, a stick of chewing gum, and 4 cigarettes. The cigarettes, by most accounts, were the only universally appreciated item in the package. Soldiers described the taste of the food itself as ranging from barely tolerable to punitive. The canned meat, a pork and egg loaf for breakfast, processed cheese or chopped ham for the other meals, took on a uniform beige appearance that defied identification by any of the 5 senses. By the 3rd consecutive week on K rations, many soldiers reported they would rather skip meals entirely than force themselves to open another tin. But they ate, because the body demanded fuel regardless of what the mind thought about the delivery mechanism. The British compo ration, distributed by section rather than individually, was considered marginally more palatable and included one item of profound psychological importance: tea. For a British soldier, tea was not merely a beverage, it was a ritual, a comfort, and a morale anchor so fundamental that the British Army's logistical planners treated its uninterrupted supply as a strategic priority. Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front subsisted on far more austere provisions: coarse black bread, buckwheat kasha, and whatever could be foraged, bartered, or stripped from captured enemy positions. German rations, which had been excellent in the early campaigns of 1939 through 1941, or deteriorated steadily after Stalingrad as Allied strategic bombing crippled rail networks, and the Wehrmacht's supply infrastructure buckled under the simultaneous pressure of fighting on multiple continental fronts. By the spring of 1945, some German formations were surviving on fewer than 1,000 calories per day. Food had become a direct, undeniable indicator of strategic reality. The army that ate was the army that was winning. Beyond the waiting and the eating, there was the physical labor. And this is perhaps the least understood dimension of the ordinary soldier's daily existence. War, at the level of the individual body, was manual work of extraordinary and unrelenting intensity. An infantryman in the European theater routinely carried between 60 and 90 pounds of equipment on his person: his rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, canteen, gas mask, steel helmet, blanket roll or shelter half, several days of rations, a first aid kit, and whatever personal items he could squeeze into what remained of his pack. He carried this weight across terrain that no road had ever been designed for, through weather that ranged from the frozen mud of the Hürtgen forest in winter to the choking dust of the Tunisian desert in summer, up mountainsides in Italy so steep they would have challenged an unburdened civilian hiker on a clear day. And above all else, he dug. The entrenching tool, a small, folding shovel weighing roughly 2.5 pounds, was arguably the single most important piece of equipment a soldier carried into the field, more critical to his survival than even his rifle. A properly dug foxhole could absorb the blast of a near-miss mortar round that would otherwise have killed everyone within a 15-meter radius. Soldiers dug foxholes every time they halted for the night. They dug them deeper when incoming artillery began finding its range. They abandoned them entirely when orders came to advance 300 meters forward, and immediately began digging new ones in the fresh position. In the Pacific, Marines assaulting islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima attempted to dig into coral and volcanic rock so dense it bent and shattered the blades of their shovels. Combat engineers worked under even more punishing conditions, laying corduroy roads through Belgian swamps, assembling Bailey bridges across swollen rivers under direct fire, or clearing German minefields by hand in slow, meticulous, terrifying grids. Tank crews routinely spent more time performing field maintenance on their vehicles than they ever spent engaged in combat, replacing broken track links with sledgehammers, cleaning clogged engine filters, and patching damaged hull plates with tools that were never quite adequate for the task. The American Sherman tank's transmission alone demanded regular adjustment that could consume an entire 5-man crew for the better part of a day. War was not a series of cinematic charges across open ground. It was a construction project conducted under the permanent threat of sudden death. In the rare hours of genuine rest between labor and waiting, the inner life of the soldier surfaced, and with it, the single most powerful morale factor identified by every major army's psychological research programs during the war: mail. The U.S. military alone processed approximately 30 billion individual pieces of correspondence over the course of the conflict. The V-mail system, an ingenious wartime innovation in which handwritten letters were photographed onto microfilm at collection points, shipped overseas in compact rolls, and then reprinted on small photographic paper at their destination, was what made this volume physically possible. A single V-mail sack of microfilm weighed only a few pounds, but carried the equivalent content of 37 full postal sacks of conventional paper letters. The compression-freed shipping tonnage that could then be allocated to ammunition, fuel, and food. The practical impact of this system on the men at the front was measurable and significant. Soldiers who received regular mail from home demonstrated consistently higher morale, substantially lower rates of combat-related psychiatric breakdown, and greater effectiveness under fire than those whose mail was delayed or absent. The letter from home was not a luxury. It was a lifeline. It was tangible proof that the world the soldier had left behind still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. That someone still knew his name for reasons that had nothing to do with his serial number. That the mud and the cold and the processed meat were temporary conditions and not permanent ones. When mail delivery was disrupted by weather, by submarine activity in the Atlantic, by logistical bottlenecks at overburdened ports, the effect on frontline morale was immediate and unmistakable. Men grew withdrawn, short-tempered, careless in ways that could get them killed. Now, experienced commanders learned quickly to treat the arrival of a mail shipment with the same operational urgency they applied to an ammunition resupply. Both kept men fighting. Only one kept them sane. And then, without warning and without transition, the waiting would end. A whistle, a shouted command cutting through the stillness. The distant, unmistakable crump of artillery shells walking closer in measured impacts. The shift from boredom to terror was never gradual. It was instantaneous, a trapdoor opening beneath normality. One moment, a man was leaning against a stone wall, sharing his last cigarette with someone whose hometown, sister's name, and mother's recipe for pot roast he knew by heart. The next moment, the air was full of metal fragments and deafening noise, and the ground was heaving beneath him, and he was running forward into something every nerve in his body was screaming at him to run from. Combat, when it finally arrived, was brief, chaotic, deafening, and overwhelming in a way that no amount of prior experience could approximate. Extensive post-war studies found that the average infantryman's effective period of continuous combat, the window during which he could function with reasonable reliability under sustained hostile fire, was roughly 60 to 90 days. Beyond that threshold, psychiatric casualties mounted at alarming rates, regardless of whether the soldier had sustained any physical wound whatsoever. Of active combat, as devastating as they were to the men who endured them, remained the statistical exception in the life of a soldier. For every hour the average man spent under direct enemy fire, he spent dozens, in many cases hundreds, digging positions, marching to new ones, standing in lines, eating food he had come to despise, writing letters he hoped would arrive before the war ended, rereading letters he was profoundly grateful to have received, repairing equipment that broke down with stubborn regularity, and then sitting in another muddy field, waiting for the next set of orders that might or might not come today. The war did not feel like a movie. It had no soundtrack swelling beneath the action, no editing to compress the dead time, no dramatic arc that promised a satisfying resolution on the horizon. Then for the people inside it, it was vast stretches of grinding, low-grade discomfort interrupted by short, blinding episodes of horror. And the discomfort was what filled the overwhelming majority of the frame. The war produced a strange and uncomfortable paradox in the men who survived it. Many returned home and found that they could not adequately explain what the experience had actually been like. Not because of the horror, though there was horror enough, but because the truth was so fundamentally undramatic that it resisted storytelling. The battles had words, the waiting did not. Veterans who tried to describe the daily texture of military life often found that civilian listeners grew visibly disappointed, waiting for the action to start, not understanding that the absence of action was itself the central experience. Over time, many simply stopped trying to explain. They let the movies tell the version people wanted to hear. This may be the most important thing we lose when we compress the Second World War into its iconic battles and decisive turning points. The millions of men and women who lived through it did not experience the conflict as a narrative with chapters and a climax. They experienced it as individual days, each one demanding its own separate act of endurance, each one resembling the last, in its essential ingredients of tedium and uncertainty. Nay, the primary enemies were not always the ones wearing a different uniform or speaking a different language. They were cold, hunger, bone-deep fatigue, loneliness, boredom so pervasive it became a kind of physical weight pressing down on the chest, and the slow, quiet corrosion of any confidence that the waiting would ever actually end. The war demanded that millions of ordinary human beings surrender not only their physical safety, but the entire framework of meaning that had previously organized their lives, and sustain that surrender, day after day, for years, with no reliable assurance that they would ever get any of it back. We remember the landings, the liberations, the flags raised over shattered buildings. We should. Those moments mattered. But the war was also 2,000 hands of rummy played in a leaking tent outside casino, and a tin of beige meat that no amount of hunger could make appetizing, and a letter from home folded and unfolded and refolded so many times that the paper finally tore apart